Poseidon didn't just rule the sea. He could end civilizations with one strike of his trident. Earthquakes, tidal waves, entire coastlines swallowed whole. The Greeks called him Earthshaker, and they meant it literally. But there's a side of Poseidon most people never hear about. The god who lost patronage of the greatest city in Greece to a tree and never once let it go. Poseidon was one of 6 children born to the Titans Kronos and Rhea. Swallowed whole at birth alongside his siblings and freed only years later when his youngest brother Zeus forced Kronos to disgorge them all, a story this channel has already told in full from Zeus's own side of it. What followed was the Titanomachy, the decade-long war that ended the old order for good. When it was over, the 3 brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, drew lots to divide the cosmos between them. Zeus took the sky. Hades took the underworld, ruling it with the same quiet, exacting order this channel has already covered in his own episode. Poseidon took the sea, along with a far broader domain than ocean alone suggests. Earthquakes, horses, and the raw unpredictability of nature itself fell under his rule too. Of the 3 brothers, Poseidon may have drawn the most volatile portfolio of all. The sea could be glass calm one moment and swallow an entire fleet the next. And that same volatility became the defining trait of the god who ruled it. Genuinely generous to sailors who honored him, and genuinely dangerous to anyone who didn't. Even his own family learned to read his moods before approaching him with a request. He ruled from an underwater palace near Aegae, an actual named location in ancient Greek geography that later sources treated as his court's fixed address, as real to the ancient imagination as Mount Olympus itself. His signature weapon, the Trident, was forged by the freed Cyclopes in the same pass that produced Zeus's thunderbolt and Hades' helm of invisibility, the Kuni. 3 brothers, 3 gifts, each one matching its bearer's own nature. With the Trident, Poseidon could summon storms, shatter bedrock, and raise entire islands from the ocean floor with a single strike. The Greeks called him Enosigaios, Earthshaker, and they meant it as literal science, not metaphor. Ancient coastal cities built shrines specifically to appease him after a quake, hoping to prevent the next one. He was also, somewhat surprisingly, credited as the creator of the horse. According to the oldest versions of the myth, he struck a bare rock during a contest with Athena, and a wild, powerful horse burst forth from the stone. An untamed gift from an untamed god, born from the same trident that leveled cities. The same weapon carried a stranger, gentler power too. Several ancient sources describe Poseidon striking the ground to bring forth freshwater springs for grateful cities. The same trident capable of drowning a coastline in one myth and giving a drought-stricken town its water supply in another. That connection between Poseidon and the horse ran deep in actual Greek worship, not just myth. He was honored under the title Poseidon Hippios, Poseidon of the horses, and equestrian competitions were considered sacred to him specifically, a living tradition that carried directly into one of his own dedicated athletic festivals. That contest with Athena is the single most famous story involving Poseidon, and it's the one where he lost. Both gods wanted patronage of a new, prosperous city on the rise, the one that would eventually become Athens. The local king proposed a simple contest. Whichever god offered the people the more valuable gift would win their devotion. Poseidon struck the ground with his trident, and salt water sprang forth. In some versions, a spring, in others, that same first horse. Athena, in turn, planted an olive tree, offering food, oil, and wood in one gift. The people, and by most accounts the king himself, judged Athena's gift the one a real civilization could actually build a future on. Poseidon lost, and did not take it gracefully. In several ancient versions, an enraged Poseidon flooded the plains of Attica in retaliation, punishing the very mortals who had chosen his rival over him. The city took Athena's name anyway. To this day, one of the most famous capitals in the ancient world carries the name of the god who beat Poseidon with a tree, and Poseidon carried the sting of that loss for the rest of his mythology, a defeat the ancient Greeks themselves clearly found worth retelling for centuries, given how many surviving versions of the contest exist. Before the myth that reframes one of this channel's own already told stories entirely, take a second to like and subscribe. Poseidon's marriage began with a chase. He fell for Amphitrite, a sea nymph, and she wanted nothing to do with him, fleeing to hide in the deepest reaches of the ocean rather than accept him. Poseidon sent messengers searching for her, and it was a dolphin who eventually found her hiding place and convinced her to return. Grateful, Poseidon placed the dolphin among the stars as the constellation Delphinus, a small, permanent thank you written into the night sky that still exists today. Amphitrite became his queen, ruling beside him in his underwater palace. Though, much like his brother Zeus, Poseidon's fidelity to her was inconsistent at best, fathering children with nymphs, mortals, and monsters throughout the rest of Greek mythology, several of whom shaped major stories of their own. Their son Triton became the sea's own herald, depicted from the waist down as a fish and carrying a great twisted conch shell he blew like a war horn. One blast to calm the waves, another to whip them into a fury, acting out at sea exactly what his father commanded from the depths. Triton's image, half man and half fish, is the actual ancient root of what later cultures would reimagine as the merman. One of those affairs connects directly to a figure this channel will eventually give her own full episode, Medusa. Poseidon pursued, or by many ancient accounts, assaulted, Medusa inside Athena's own temple. Athena, enraged by the desecration of her sacred space, punished Medusa rather than Poseidon, transforming her into the monster remembered in myth today. It's a detail that reframes her entire story before it's even told. Her curse was never really about anything she did. It was collateral damage from Poseidon's own actions and Athena's misdirected fury. When Perseus later beheaded Medusa, two beings sprang from her blood, the winged horse Pegasus and the warrior Chrysaor, both of them Poseidon's own children, conceived in that same temple. Poseidon's temper didn't only fall on people who defied him directly. Sometimes it fell on people who simply failed to keep a promise. When King Minos of Crete asked the gods for a sign to confirm his right to rule, Poseidon sent a magnificent white bull up out of the sea on one condition: Minos would sacrifice it back to him. Minos took one look at the bull and decided it was too beautiful to kill, quietly substituting a lesser animal instead. Poseidon noticed immediately. In punishment, he cursed Minos' own wife, Pasiphae, with an overwhelming, unnatural desire for the bull itself, a curse so complete that it eventually produced the Minotaur, the bull-headed monster this channel will one day give its own episode to. One broken promise over livestock, and an entire kingdom ended up housing a monster in a labyrinth beneath its palace because of it. A labyrinth King Minos then had to commission specifically to contain the very creature Poseidon's own curse had created, a punishment that reshaped an entire royal bloodline's legacy for generations. That same grudge-holding streak defined Poseidon's dealings with Troy, generations before the Trojan War most people actually know. Poseidon and Apollo built the massive walls of Troy for its king, Laomedon, under a promised payment. Laomedon cheated them out of it. Poseidon never forgot. When the Trojan War finally broke out, generations later, Poseidon sided firmly with the Greeks, not out of any particular love for them, but because a grudge that old doesn't simply expire on its own. That exact pattern reaches its peak in Homer's Odyssey. After the hero Odysseus blinded Poseidon's own son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, on his journey home from that same war, Poseidon cursed him personally, scattering his fleet, drowning his men, and stretching a voyage that should have taken weeks into a 10-year ordeal. Unlike Zeus, who ruled through broad political authority, or Hades, who enforced impersonal cosmic law, Poseidon's punishments were always intensely personal. He didn't just enforce rules, he held grudges, sometimes for generations, and pursued every one of them relentlessly. Homer even records Poseidon returning to the ruins of Troy after the war ended, tearing down the great defensive wall the Greek army itself had built on the beach, redirecting rivers to wash away every trace of it. The Earthshaker's literal power turned loose on human architecture one final time, just to make sure nothing of that war's memory outlasted his own. Of the three brothers, Poseidon is arguably the most emotionally volatile. Zeus ruled through calculated authority and constant political maneuvering. Hades ruled through quiet, consistent order, rarely swayed by feeling at all. Poseidon ruled through raw, unpredictable force, generous to sailors who honored him with offerings, catastrophic to entire coastlines when he felt disrespected. Ancient sailors genuinely feared displeasing him more than almost any other god, precisely because his domain was the one place mortals had the least control and the most to lose. A calm sea could turn violent within minutes, and the Greeks attributed every one of those sudden storms directly to his mood, not to chance. Where Zeus's anger was a matter of politics and Hades' judgment was a matter of law, Poseidon's anger was a matter of weather, invisible until the moment it wasn't, and impossible to negotiate with once it started. Much of what we know about Poseidon comes from Homer's Odyssey, where his feud with Odysseus drives much of the plot, and from Hesiod's Theogony, which establishes his origins and his portion of the divided cosmos. A short surviving Homeric hymn is addressed to him directly, invoking him by both of his domains at once, shaker of the earth and the barren sea, a two-line summary ancient worshippers actually used in real devotional practice, not just poetic flourish. The geographer Pausanias, writing centuries later, documented numerous temples and shrines dedicated to Poseidon across Greece, especially in coastal regions prone to earthquakes, confirming just how seriously ancient communities took the need to keep him appeased. One of his most famous surviving temples still stands at Cape Sounion, perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, where sailors once left offerings before every voyage. The Greeks dedicated an entire athletic festival to him as well, the Isthmian Games, held near Corinth every 2 years and rivaling the Olympics themselves in prestige, a natural extension of his Poseidon Hippios title, since equestrian and chariot events were among the festival's most prized competitions. Roman mythology later adapted him into Neptune, keeping his trident, his temper, and his dominion over the sea largely intact, though Roman Neptune leaned somewhat more toward naval warfare and less toward earthquakes specifically. Poseidon's legacy is genuinely more contradictory than either of his brothers. He's remembered as a protector, sailors prayed to him before every voyage, and as one of mythology's most dangerous grudge-holders, capable of stretching a decade of a man's life or an entire kingdom's fate into punishment for a single broken promise. He lost the one contest that might have defined his legacy forever, to a tree in a city that still doesn't carry his name 3,000 years later. And yet the ocean itself still carries his reputation, unpredictable, powerful, capable of calm or catastrophe within the same hour. Every culture that has ever depended on the sea for survival has needed some version of Poseidon, a name for the exact moment calm water decides, without warning, to become something else entirely. Subscribe so you don't miss whoever comes next.